I don't normally use one of these, and that's because I come from the northeast of England. Anybody else here from the northeast? And we don't normally need anything to amplify our voices at all. So apologies if I forget to use it, and apologies if you can't hear at the corner, but just wave at me. This is going to be an extremely informal kind of talk. Yes, I've been at Dundee for quite a long time now. In fact, I achieved my long service award at Abertay, and I've now been at Abertay for 17 years. So yes. Ken's just reminded me that I am still doing research at the University of Abertay, and I'm just about to set up something called the Abertay Ageing Alliance. And my plan there is to have some people from out in the community of Dundee who have an interest in the university and its work, hopefully an interest in my work, who would like to collaborate with me, both as volunteering in some of the research projects, but also as a sort of steering group, giving suggestions as to what sort of public talks we ought to have, and maybe even suggesting workshops that you'd like academics at Abertay to undertake on your behalf. We have sociologists there, we have people in the business school, sport, nursing, and I'm sure if the Alliance had, for instance, an interest in physical activity or health, or even more controversial subjects, I'm sure my sociology colleagues would be very interested in talking to you, along with psychologists, about end-of-life decisions, which is a huge and really important topic, and something which I think the university could be generating material to help you become informed about that. So if you'd like to join the Abertay Ageing Alliance, if you just put a note on the notes on your table, that would be great, and then I can get back to you and tell you more about it. So, this is me, and with any luck, this joint pressing of buttons is going to work. It really doesn't matter if you can't see the PowerPoint slides. In fact, they're really partly only there so that I could insert my theme tunes at the start and at the end, and a little bit of a prompt to me. So there's nothing going on that you're missing, and with any luck, you'll be able to follow what I say. This is in some ways a kind of personal odyssey, in that I began my research as a cognitive neuropsychologist back in 1986, and I did work on amnesia. It seems to me that my subject very much focuses on looking at what has gone wrong. So with amnesia, we were developing theories of amnesia very much based on the mistakes that people made, the things they couldn't do. And that is the focus of neuropsychology. You discover how the normal engine works by looking at what happens when it breaks down. It's what you might call backwards engineering. If you take your car to a mechanic, he or she will listen to it, and they'll be able to observe what is happening now, what's wrong with the car now, and figure out what must have happened to the car to bring about the situation that you're seeing now. So that's what cognitive neuropsychology does. It looks at errors. And after 25 years of doing this, I've been finding that my opinions have been changing. And it's almost entirely because of my contact with lots and lots of people, hundreds of people in my research. And I'm very pleased to say that I have some of my dear friends from the Dundee and Angus Parkinson's Society branch here. And they were really instrumental in helping me to work through a different way of approaching research, moving away from looking at impaired processes and starting to look at intact ones, trying to find the things that are still working, that we might be able to use for things like rehabilitation. And so way back when I started working with Parkinson's disease and with the people in the branch, it was very much their friendship and their attitude to Parkinson's that's really influenced me in the last 10 years. So Abraham Lincoln also agrees with me when he says that in the end, it's not the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. And the message that I'm going to try and give you today is not a particularly popular one in the scientific community. Although this is Cafe Science, I'm not actually talking to you about science. I'm not anti-science either. But I suppose my message in the end is somewhat philosophical. But I hope by the end I might have you convinced that you'll go along with me. So what's this all about? Some of you, and I think I've already chatted to some people who have a philosophy background. They've either done it at university or maybe they do a lot of reading in their spare time. And a very famous philosopher is Descartes. And his dates are 1596 to 1650. And when Descartes was around, science really wasn't there because you weren't allowed to ask questions. Everything you needed to know was in the Bible. Everything that you needed to know was as God intended it to be. Man was made in the image of God. There really wasn't any reason to investigate anything at all. And Descartes didn't go along with that. He felt somehow that at the centre of man's being was the need to question. And that was a very risky thing to do. It was blasphemous. And so he really built science on taking an enormous risk. Some of you might have gone to a pub quiz and be familiar with the Latin phrase cogito, ergo, sum. And what Descartes meant by that is that really the fundamental aspect of being human, what makes you who you are, is that you think and you question. And it's quite a simple idea, and I think it would probably appeal to most people on the street. It's straightforward, and yet the scientific community in psychology and in neuropsychology, we often forget that. We're so busy investigating what thought is and having really complicated experiments that we lose sight of what thought feels like. And so for Descartes, he began us on this journey of trying to think about what thought is for humans and how that makes us different to animals. Sorry, what's happening here is my very clever computer is periodically trying to contact Wi-Fi in this cafe. It's not at all interested in the talk, so. And the general principle that arose out of this was what's called the body-mind problem. So Descartes had a think, and he thought, well, what we've got is a physical body. And the physical body is subject to the laws of physics. So if I trip over this and fall down and bang my head, because of gravity, my body is going to fall, my head is going to hit the floor. There's going to be damage to my head because of it hitting the floor. There's nothing that I can do with my body that breaks the laws of physics. If I jump off something, I'm going to go down. However, the mind does not obey the laws of physics. I can imagine myself to be 200 years in the past. I can imagine I'm a man. I could turn everybody in this audience into penguins. I can do whatever I like in my mind because I'm not bound by the laws of space and time. And Descartes thought that that was a fundamental distinction, that you would have the body that was subject to physical laws that you could do experiments on, and the mind which was beyond experiment. And he called issues to do with the mind metaphysical ones. metaphysics is a branch of philosophy. And basically what he said was that, well, you can't really investigate the mind. It's ineffable. You can't look at it. You can't measure it. It's something beyond what we can do science on. Now, most psychologists would say that's just not the case. We can do experiments on everything and anything, metaphysical or not. But I think, again, for most people on the street, that's how you make sense of your life. There's the stuff, your body, you know, your cells, and then there's this thing inside you that's personal to you, that somehow isn't really to do with your body. It's you, it's who you are, and it's separate from all the other things that you are. It's what you are when you're alone, perhaps just before you go to sleep. That's who you, well, that's how I feel I am. That's the centre of me. But in psychology, and particularly in my area of neuropsychology, we put all this body-mind stuff out of the way. Anything that we can't actually do an experiment about is a bit embarrassing. So we'll just focus on the things we can do experiments about, and more particularly, more recently, the things we can take pictures of, because that's even easier. So for a cognitive neuropsychologist, if you said, where is me? Where is the seat of the soul? Where's me? They'd say, oh, well, it's all in your brain. And what's more, I'm going to do some experiments, and I'm going to take some pictures of the inside of your brain, and I'll be able to tell you where your soul is inside your brain. So obviously, everything comes out of the brain, so it must be there somewhere, right? So for people in my area, we haven't really got an answer for you, for who you really are, the central soul of you, apart from saying it's in your brain. And that's what's always troubled me. I went to university, actually, as somebody with quite a strong faith, brought up in the Church of Scotland, but then came to university to be told that, well, all that stuff, that's a bit fluffy, isn't it? You can't do an experiment about that. And so I laid it all aside as things that you couldn't really explain. And now, in my older years, I'm thinking, well, no, actually, I'm still interested in the same thing. How do humans become these essential beings, everyone different from everybody else? So this is what I'm trying to drill into in this talk, and it might not work because I'm out of my comfort zone. I'm not going to be talking about experiments that I've done that have been funded by the Medical Research Council and have loads and loads of journal articles to my name. I'm not. What I'm pursuing, or what I'm sharing with you, is something that's kind of puzzled me for a long, long time. And I think it's the sort of thing that puzzles most people. I'm probably going too slowly. So Ken, pick me. So, sorry about that, but the rest of it I'll go faster. So, let's have a look at the brain. Is there any evidence? If we look at the brain, can we answer the question of the soul? Can you see the soul inside the brain? Well, if I start off with people with amnesia, a lot of people would say what makes me distinctly who I am is my memories. That's who I am. All the things I remember going back to childhood, the things that are happening now, they're my memories, they're not the same as other people's. My memories make me who I am. But in amnesia, people have damaged memory, but I can attest they don't have damaged sense of self. Sure, they can't remember things, but they're still them. So if you want to say, oh, well, who I am is really just down to some memories stored in my brain, I would say, no, that's not what I feel when I'm with people who have amnesia. So maybe who I am is how I communicate. Maybe who I am is what I say, the way I say it. Certainly in our society, we assume that anybody who's fluent must be clever or must have something to say. But you only need to think about MPs to realise how silly that is. It does have this bad consequence, though, because one of the first things that happens if you have a stroke and a speech problem, and there are many different types of speech problem, is a huge lack of confidence. Because you know fine and well that the people listening to you are going to make assumptions about you just because you can't get the words out. But again, I can attest, if you sit next to somebody and chat to them, and please do, no matter how difficult it is for them, talk to them, you'll see that just because the words aren't coming out, that doesn't mean the thoughts are in a mess. The thoughts are still there, and just imagine how frustrating that is for this self, this person who's the same person they've been since they were 5, not being able to reach out and talk to you anymore. And the fear that you might assume that there isn't a self in there because you can't hear it speak. Agnosia is something that people aren't quite so familiar with, but it's a very peculiar condition where people lose the link between what something looks like and understanding it. So if Ken was agnosic, I could show this to him. He could probably describe it very carefully. He's not blind, nothing wrong with his vision. But if I asked him what it was for, he wouldn't know. Because there isn't a link between, there isn't a link between the visual world and what he understands. But he still understands, he still knows what to do with pens. The only thing that's gone wrong, the only break in the chain, is the link between when the light goes into the back of his eyes and his brain, it doesn't marry up to what things mean anymore. But the thoughts are still there. Prosopagnosia is even more mysterious. In prosopagnosia, people lose the link between vision and what that vision means to do with faces. And this, if anything, is even more profoundly disturbing in a social setting than not being able to speak. Because basically, everyone you meet is a stranger. Because when you even see your wife or your husband, you don't get that instant, this is my wife, this is my husband, until you hear them talk. And then you're going round the outside, you're cutting through the link that's gone between vision and understanding, going a different direction and using what you hear to marry up to the meaning. So it's not that the relationship's gone, it's just, if you like, something that's kind of like a bit of a broken engine, but it doesn't damage the person, it doesn't damage the self. If anything, if that person feels damaged, it's because we've damaged them. We've made assumptions, we've imposed something about, you're old, you've had a stroke, you can't even recognise your own husband. What's wrong with you then? Another peculiar thing to do with vision, something called neglect. Now this can happen if you have, say, a stroke on the right-hand side of your brain, which is right, then you effectively ignore everything on the left-hand side of the world. Now this is most peculiar. I've only ever seen one patient with this, and that was in the States in a special sort of institute for looking into problems of neglect. And it's mind-boggling. So if you put a plate in front of this person, they will eat everything on the left-hand side and not eat the right. If you ask them to draw a clock, they'll do everything on half the clock, maybe 1 to 6, and not do 6 to 12. What on earth is going on? Most peculiar distortion of the visual world. And how about the time now? Is it okay? Yeah. So I'm going to attempt, given that I find this baffling, right? And the last time I tried to tell my students this, I did get a little bit confused, because I can't do left and right, never have been able to. The Italians, who are very elegant at neuropsychological experiments, did what's known as the Piazza experiment with a person who had neglect. So they stood him at one end of the piazza and asked him to look across to the other end where there was a church. And he has neglect, so he described the right-hand side of the piazza perfectly well, but couldn't describe the left. And this is where it gets complicated. The experimenter then said, imagine in your head that you've walked down to the other side. And in his head, in his mental image, he then was able to describe the side of the piazza which he couldn't see before. So what we've got is this the mental world is still intact. But you wouldn't have known it was intact unless you'd done that experiment, that really clever experiment. Most people would have thought, well, this man, he can't draw a clock. Yeah, can't draw it. But then this very elegant experiment can show, well, actually, it's a lot more complicated than that, because in his head, the world is as it should be. I hope you are still with me. For those of you who can't see this, this is the one and only slide where it's a little bit helpful to see it. This artist, I can't, apologies to anybody who speaks German, Anton Raderstein, is that right? You can look him up on Google if you type in artist with neglect. And this man had a stroke, and he was a very, very gifted artist, particularly in portraiture. And what you found when he first started to recover was that just like the people with the clock, he drew in his self-portrait half of his own face. So what's intriguing about this is it's the self, the portrait of the self, and he's drawing himself. You must know what he looks like. But because of this stroke, only half of it is coming out. And as he began to recover, gradually the portraits, as the months went by, filled out to the point where he was again able to do a self-portrait with the whole face intact. So I won't pretend to understand what was going on there, but I suppose what I'm asserting, and it is asserting because this is not scientific, what I'm asserting is that his eyes and his hands and his coordination were being controlled by the neglect. But the world in his head was as it should be. Now, Anton syndrome, I've certainly never seen a person with Anton syndrome, but a very, very amazing neurologist called Oliver Sacks, that's S-A-C-K-S, fabulous person, marvellous research, and a really humane and compassionate person. I think if you read one author in your whole life about the brain, read Oliver Sacks. So he talks about a patient who can't see, just blind, but they believe that they can. And his patient actually watched television and told Oliver Sacks that he was watching television. And so what might be happening there is that, in a way, his mental world was actually completely dominating over the facts of the fact that he was functionally blind. And I think that Oliver Sacks says at one point that he says he hasn't quite got the hang of watching television anymore, or something like that. But obviously, once you get into these really very, very rare, complicated conditions, then my argument might start to fall down. But bear with, as they say on Miranda. So you might say, well, the one thing I know about myself is my body. I know that this is my hand, and I know that this is my head, and I feel as if I live inside this carapace, and it's part of who I am. But in phantom limb syndrome, that whole assumption is really distorted, because here people find that even after amputation, they can still feel the missing limb. So the self, the internal model of the self, is overriding the fact there is no foot there in the soldier who's come back from Helmand. There is no foot, but he feels as if it's still there. And when you take into account that many of these young men and women are young, just imagine how torturous it is to still feel this this limb that is no longer there. But the self, for the self, that limb still is there. There are lots of really clever ways that people can be helped to get over this. In fact, Ken knows a lot about them, but at the risk of skipping out the really tricky stuff, I'll go on to it. In anosognosia, or anosognosia, that's just an umbrella term for people having a neurological disorder and completely denying that they've got it. And it does happen. A sort of related aspect of this is that people with amnesia are often said to confabulate. Now, they're not lying. They really believe that they're remembering real things. And it does have its difficulties, because are you really going to be the one to say, well, you can't possibly remember what you had for breakfast yesterday, and in fact what you're remembering is wrong anyway, because for them, their self, their world inside is dominating what's going on.